She'd always been the type to wake up early, put fresh coffee in the pot, and listen to a sermon on the radio while the sun warmed the porch. Margaret had been through a lot, but the last few months had a different weight. There was something in the air she couldn't name, a kind of silence that wasn't just a lack of sound, but an absence of affection. Her daughter, Diane, had moved back in with her after the divorce. At first, it was good. Companionship, laughter, even popcorn on the couch on Wednesdays. But little by little, Diane changed. She began checking her mother's medications, monitoring what she ate, turning off the TV early, even hiding the front door key. Margaret began to feel like a visitor in her own home. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. One afternoon, Margaret noticed that the bedroom doorknob no longer turned from the inside. She tried to open it slowly, quietly, but it was locked. She heard footsteps in the hallway. She called for Diane, and she responded in an overly sweet tone, "It's just for a while, Mommy. You need to rest." But rest from what? She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, trying to remember if she'd done something wrong. Was she forgetting things? Or was Diane seeing things that weren't there? The worst part was not knowing, and the fear of asking. Memories of caring for her own parents came flooding back, and she thought, is this how it all ends? Margaret didn't want to fight, or raise her voice. But that feeling of being controlled was turning into agony. A subtle, suffocating agony, as if time were shrinking around her. She tried to open the window, but it was locked too. It was then that she saw it. Her cell phone was no longer on the nightstand. She got up and paced the room, trying to understand. A piece of paper on the dresser caught her eye. It was a note, in her daughter's handwriting. "Mommy, I love you. This is for your own good. You're no longer safe alone." That hurt more than any screaming match could have. What no one knew was that Margaret was still lucid. Clearly lucid. What was going on? Was it love, or control? Protection, or manipulation? She tried knocking on the door, a timid knock, then a louder one. Diane appeared with a tray of soup and a plastic smile. "Eat it all, and we'll talk later." Margaret wanted to ask, but stopped herself. Something was deeply wrong. The next day, Diane didn't let her mother leave the room until noon. She said she needed rest. But Margaret was already rested. What she wanted was to walk in the garden, smell the roses, remember God. She remembered Psalm 23, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," and prayed silently. On the third day, Margaret began to suspect that Diane was hiding more than she was telling. And that's when she had an idea. She waited for her daughter to leave for the market, grabbed a hairpin, and tried to unlock the door. After 20 minutes of trying, nothing. And then, almost like a divine answer, the house phone rang. The sound came from far away, from the living room. An old, analog ringtone, almost forgotten. Diane wasn't home. Margaret ran to the door and shouted, "Hello! Hello! I'm here!" The phone kept ringing. And ringing. And ringing. She knocked hard on the door, but no one answered. Then, it stopped. And then, it started again. What no one knew was that that phone call would change everything. And the voice on the other end wasn't who Margaret expected. It wasn't her neighbor, nor her church pastor. It was someone from her past. Someone she thought had disappeared years ago. A name she hadn't heard since her father's funeral. At that moment, the air grew heavy. Margaret's legs felt weak. How did this person have her home number? How did he know she was there? The voice was firm, masculine, thick with emotion. "Margaret, you need to leave this house. Now." And then, the line dropped. She stood there, paralyzed. The phone was silent. The room was silent. The world was silent. And within that silence, an echo of hope. Who was that man? How did he know? And why did she feel, for a second, that God was saying, "I am with you"? For the next few minutes, she tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. She remembered the smell of childhood, her mother's lap, Christmas mornings with her father. She remembered the promise, "Honor your father and your mother." But what happens when a son or daughter doesn't honor their father or mother? What no one imagines is that this kind of thing happens in many American homes. Elderly, lucid women are treated as incapable, locked in their own homes, in the name of love. But love without freedom is prison. And Margaret was about to prove that not every prison has bars. And that was when she decided, the next time Diane left, she would try to escape. It didn't matter if I succeeded or not. The important thing was to try. Because if God allowed that connection, maybe it was a sign. Maybe a last chance. Hope was rekindled like a small but bright flame. She searched the room for anything that might help. She found a thick candle in the drawer, one of those prayer candles. And right there, kneeling on the floor, she made her most sincere prayer in years. "Lord, if you are still with me, show me the way. Open a door, any door. But don't let me die here." And when he stood up, something strange happened. The doorknob, which had been locked, turned. Slowly, as if someone on the other side had opened it. But there was no one outside. The hallway was empty. The bathroom light was on. And a strange smell was in the air, like lavender and smoke. She walked slowly, tiptoeing, her heart racing. The phone in the living room was off the hook. She replaced it, expecting it to ring again. But it didn't. Instead, the sound that came was different. A whisper, coming from her daughter's room. As if someone was there. But Diane hadn't returned yet. Curious and frightened, Margaret approached the door. She put her ear to the wood. What she heard, you won't believe. Margaret hesitated for a few seconds before pushing open her daughter's bedroom door. Dim light streamed in through the half-open window. Everything seemed normal. The bed was made, the flowery bedspread was tucked away, the self-help books were stacked. But there was something there, a humming sound. A low, continuous sound, as if something were recording. She followed the sound to the closet. She pushed aside the coats and felt something behind it. It was a small black box with a blinking red light. A digital recorder. Margaret had never seen it before. And there, beside it, was a notebook with dates, times, and short phrases. Phrases she recognized, because they were hers. Heart racing, she pressed the play button. Her own voice echoed through the room. "Diane, why did you lock the window?" Then another recording, "I'm not crazy. You know that." With each click, more clips. Everyday moments, but recorded coldly, as if they were evidence of something much greater. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't normal. Why would Diane be recording all of this? And even more so, why hide it among old clothes? Then, at the back of the closet, she saw a metal box. Opening it, her eyes widened. Inside were papers from her deceased sister's psychiatric hospital. What no one knew, not even Diane, she thought, was that her sister had been institutionalized unfairly. Out of envy, out of inheritance. Margaret remembered perfectly. It was a trauma the family never overcame. And now, faced with those documents, she realized that Diane was repeating a cycle that had already destroyed her family. The penny dropped like an avalanche. Did Diane think she was just like her aunt? Or was Diane using the same pretext to get what she wanted? The inheritance. The house. Control. The lawyer's name on the paper seemed familiar. Margaret remembered. He was the same one who had handled her aunt's paperwork. She sat on the edge of her daughter's bed, the recorder still in her hand. Her heart felt like it was about to burst from her chest. And it was then that she realized one of the recordings was recent, from that very morning. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. And then, she heard something she would never forget. The voice was Diane's. On the phone. Saying, "She's almost giving in. If I can get the doctor's report, I'll sign the papers tomorrow. The house will be mine in a week." Margaret was shocked. The blood seemed to drain from her face. So that was it. Was it all because of the house? The deed? But there was something even worse. Following the recording, Diane said, "If she reacts, I can prove she's confused. I recorded everything." The lawyer said that's enough to interdict her. Interdict. That word hit like a hammer blow. Margaret remembered the Bible. The love of money is the root of all evil. She never imagined her own daughter would do this. And deep down, she still didn't want to believe it. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe her daughter was scared, pressured. But the pain was real. This wasn't love. It was manipulation. It was betrayal. She needed to act. With slow steps, she put away the recorder and left the room. The hallway seemed darker now. More hostile. It was her home, but she no longer felt at home. She needed help. And then she remembered the voice on the phone. Who was that man? How did he know all of this? He descended the stairs carefully. He dialed the landline. The number was still in the history, unknown number. He dialed back. He rang once, twice, 3 times, until someone answered. It was him. The voice said, "Margaret, listen carefully. You're in danger, and I can help you. But there's one condition." She could barely speak. "Who are you?" The answer left her in shock. "I'm David, your son-in-law, Diane's ex-husband, and I know what she's doing." Margaret felt the ground disappear from her. David. He'd disappeared years ago. Diane said he was dangerous, manipulative, a liar. But what if it were the other way around? David continued, "She tried to have me interdicted, too. She said I was unstable. I almost lost everything. But I escaped in time. I know her moves. I know how she thinks. And I know what you need to do now." Margaret wasn't sure if she trusted him. But one thing was certain. He seemed to know Diane better than anyone. David gave her detailed instructions. He told her to look for an envelope hidden in the attic. It contained documents Diane didn't want anyone to see. Things from the past. Evidence. Margaret climbed the stairs, phone in hand, her heart pounding like a drum. It was now or never. In the attic, among Christmas boxes and family albums, she found a brown folder. When she opened it, her eyes filled with tears. They were letters. Letters Margaret had written when Diane was a child, but never delivered. Letters about abandonment, about guilt, about an accident that changed everything. And then came the third twist, an old photo, torn and taped together. In it, Margaret held Diane in her arms, next to an unknown woman. On the back of the photo, something handwritten, "To my daughter with love, Mommy." But the handwriting wasn't Margaret's. The photo proved something Margaret had buried decades ago. Diane, perhaps she wasn't her biological daughter. Or at least, not in the way everyone thought. A hidden adoption? A family secret? And if so, what else was being hidden? And why? At that moment, everything began to spin. Margaret sat on the attic floor, the photo in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She felt the past coming back with full force. And what she thought was a story of control was perhaps a story of identity. She needed help. And fast. She called David again. He told him about the photo, about the papers, about everything. On the other end, he was silent. Then he said, "Margaret, you don't know who Diane really is. But I do. And there's something else you need to find out. Something that's buried in the basement." The stairs leading to the basement creaked as if whispering ancient secrets. Margaret descended slowly, the air growing colder and damper with each step. A dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that danced across the concrete walls. It was a place she hadn't visited since her husband passed away. The basement was just as she remembered it. Stacked boxes, old tools, a wooden chest covered in a white sheet. But something was different. A smell, not of mildew, but of aged paper, burnt wood, and perfume. A sweet, familiar scent. Of someone she hadn't seen in a long time. Removing the sheet from the trunk, she found old notebooks, trinkets, even a children's Bible with the name Diane engraved in gold. She opened the book. Inside was a never-before-read letter. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. But what it said was heartbreaking. "Dear Margaret, if you ever read this, it will be because I couldn't hide it anymore. The letter revealed that Diane had been left in Margaret's care after an accident involving her biological mother, a woman named Lorraine. Margaret vaguely remembered the name but never learned the details. The letter stated that Lorraine was her distant cousin, who suffered from mental illness and was unable to care for her daughter. Margaret froze. This changed everything. Diane didn't know. Or did she? Maybe she'd figured it out on her own. Maybe this was the source of the anger, the desire for control, the pain of abandonment disguised as power. It was all deeper than it seemed. And then Margaret saw it. Deep in the basement, a wall covered in peeling paint. And on it, a name written in charcoal. It was the name, Lorraine. Beside it, a date, June, 1992. And beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, "She'll hate me when she finds out." Margaret fell to her knees. She felt the weight of her entire life on her shoulders. All of it, the guilt, the silence, the fear. Now it was coming to the surface. The memory was clear as a flash. The night Lorraine appeared at the door, drenched in rain, with a baby in her arms. The promise Margaret made, to care for Diane as if she were her own. But she never told the truth. And perhaps that silence became poison. A wound that grew along with her daughter. That night, Margaret cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. She felt shame, regret, compassion. But she also felt something new, clarity. What Diane was doing was wrong, but it stemmed from an old pain. A pain she had perhaps caused herself, without realizing it. Forgiveness began to blossom there. Back in the letter, there was one final instruction. If Diane grows up and asks who she is, tell her she is loved. That God never makes mistakes in choosing the parents of the heart. Margaret held onto that sentence like a beacon. She needed to find a way to talk to her daughter. But first, she needed to understand if Diane knew all of this. She returned to the living room, called David, and told him what she had found. He was silent for a few seconds, then said something that changed everything. She knew. "I found out when I saw an old diary of hers. She found a similar letter 2 years ago. Since then, she's never been the same." Margaret felt a pang in her chest. So Diane was trying to punish, not just out of pain, but because she'd felt cheated her entire life. That explained the recordings, the control, the isolation. But still, it didn't justify it. Pain can't become a prison. Love must free. What no one from the outside saw was the depth of Diane's inner conflict. Raised by a woman who loved her deeply but never told her the truth, she carried the burden of a past that wasn't hers, and a name that had been hidden behind a wall in the basement. The next morning, Margaret decided to wait for her daughter in the kitchen. The table was set, coffee was made, and the letter was in hand. When Diane arrived, she stopped at the door. She looked at her mother, then at the letter. The silence was thick. Until Margaret said, her voice firm, "I know you know." Diane trembled. Her hands were empty, her eyes filled with tears. But before she could answer, something unexpected happened. A car stopped in front of the house. It honked once. And then, a woman got out of the passenger seat. An elderly woman with gray hair and a distressed look. Margaret froze. Diane too. And you won't believe who it was. She stood there on the porch of the house, as if time had frozen. Her white hair, tied in a simple bun. Her deep eyes, filled with pain and hope. Lorraine. 30 years later, alive. Margaret felt the breath leave her lungs. Diane didn't say a word. She just stared at the woman as if she were a ghost. Lorraine stepped forward. In her hands, she held a small wooden box. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice breaking. Margaret made room. Diane, instinctively, stepped back. They entered the room. The sound of the door closing behind them was like thunder. The silence that followed, cut like a knife. The box was placed on the table. Lorraine opened it carefully. Inside were letters, photographs, and an old notebook with medical notes. She pointed to the papers. "All these years, I was alive. I was institutionalized against my will. They said I was dangerous. But I wasn't. I was just depressed." Diane trembled. "You abandoned me." Lorraine shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, my daughter. I was ripped from you. And when I tried to come back, they said you wouldn't recognize me. That it was better to leave everything as it was." Margaret wept silently. Her pain was deep, but her regret was even greater. Lorraine handed Diane an envelope. Inside, a certificate. "This is your true story. You were created with love, I know that. But your origin is also love. It's just a love that has been silenced." Diane couldn't speak. Her hands clutched the paper as if trying to absorb every word written there. Margaret tried to explain. "I didn't know how to tell you. You were just a baby. And then time passed, and I was afraid. Afraid of losing you." Lorraine looked at her sweetly. "You saved me when you took care of her. But now it's time for the truth to come out. No one can live on a lie forever." Diane stood up abruptly. "What do you want me to do? Forget that I've been lied to my whole life." Her voice was filled with hurt, but also with fragility. Lorraine approached slowly. "I don't want you to forget. I want you to understand. To know me. To see who I am. Not because of what they said, but because of the truth." It was at that moment that the box revealed its biggest surprise, a cassette recording. Lorraine explained, "I recorded this at the clinic when I realized I might never leave. It was the only way you'd ever hear my voice." Margaret inserted the tape into the old player in the living room. The hissing sound filled the room, and then the younger Lorraine's voice began. "My dear Diane, if you ever hear this, know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. I was taken from you, but in every prayer I asked God to protect you. If Margaret is by your side, trust her. She was chosen. And God doesn't make mistakes in his choices. One day, the truth will come out. And on that day, I will still love you." The impact was devastating. Diane fell to her knees. That sound, that voice, that pain. Everything mingled. It was as if her soul were breaking and rebuilding itself at the same time. Margaret approached, placing her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Lorraine knelt down on the other side. 3 generations, broken, and at the same time, being healed. Diane murmured, "I don't know what to do." Lorraine replied, "Just listen to me. Give me a chance." And then, as if divinely inspired, Margaret opened the Bible on the table. He read aloud, tears in his eyes, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The verse echoed like healing in that room. At that moment, something changed in Diane's gaze. There was still pain, yes. But now, there was also doubt. And where there is doubt, there can be forgiveness. Lorraine took her hands. "I am your mother. And this woman is too. In different ways, but equally real. You are a child of love, not of error." The afternoon passed in silence. No one was in a hurry. Lorraine told stories. She showed old photos. They laughed, they cried. Margaret felt the weight of 30 years begin to lift from her shoulders. Diane seemed calmer, but her eyes were still lost. Until, out of nowhere, she said something no one expected. "I've been hiding something, too." Margaret and Lorraine looked at each other. Diane got up, went to her room, and returned with an envelope. She handed it to her adoptive mother. "It's the deed to the house. I was going to transfer everything into my name. But now, I guess that doesn't matter anymore." Margaret opened it and saw the papers. They were ready, already signed, but never delivered. Lorraine touched her daughter's hand. "What matters is what you do from now on. God brought you here. Now, you choose your path." Diane wept. "I just want to know who I am." Margaret, her voice calm, replied, "You are our daughter, and always will be, because love is not divided. It multiplies." That night, for the first time in many years, the 3 of them dined together. The table, once a scene of silence, now held voices, stories, and hope. But outside the house, across the street, someone was watching. Someone who hadn't yet appeared in this story. And what that person knows will change everything once again. The next morning, as Margaret watered the garden plants, something caught her eye. Across the street, sitting in the porch rocking chair, was Mr. Thompson. As always, he wore a wide-brimmed hat, a flannel coat, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. But this time, he was staring at her. She nodded politely. He responded with a restrained gesture, then pointed to the gate. Margaret frowned. He stood and crossed the street with slow but determined steps. "Can I talk to you for a moment, Miss Margaret?" he said, his voice hoarse but firm. She nodded, a little suspicious. They sat on the porch. Thompson pulled an envelope from his inside coat pocket. "I've been silent for too long. But I think it's time you knew." Margaret opened the envelope. Inside were photos, dates, handwritten notes, thumbnailed videos. Everything about the past few months. About Diane. About the house's visitors. Margaret's eyes widened. "You filmed us?" Thompson nodded, looking both embarrassed and sincere. "Yes. Because something wasn't right. I saw when Diane changed. I saw when she started blocking visitors. I saw the day the pastor came and left without coming in. I saw it all. And I heard more than I wanted to." One of the photos showed Diane arguing with a man in the garage. Another showed an envelope being delivered to a local doctor. And another, the most shocking, showed Diane opening a safe hidden in the living room bookshelf, containing papers Margaret had never seen. "I recorded it too. With audio. There's more going on than you realize." Mr. Thompson explained that he began recording everything instinctively. "I'm old, but I'm not blind. My wife used to say that when the Holy Spirit bothers, it's because there's truth hidden." Margaret felt a chill. "Why didn't you say anything before?" He looked up at the sky. "Because I was afraid. But now, I'm more afraid of what might happen if I keep quiet." He showed a video on his cell phone, Diane talking on the phone to someone named Dr. Miller. "She'll sign, even if she doesn't want to. The report will be approved. Everything's fine now." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. Dr. Miller was the doctor who'd examined her the month before. He'd said everything was fine. But what if he'd lied? Indignation began to grow. Margaret realized she was surrounded by lies, and that the roots of this plot extended beyond her home. Mr. Thompson continued, "I know this doctor. I've seen this kind of game before. Money, property, silent agreements. People who take advantage of the aging." Margaret's heart sank. "Can you prove it?" He nodded. "Yes. And I will. But there's one name you need to hear. Someone behind all this." And then he said, "Attorney Peterson." Margaret froze. Peterson was the man who had handled the family's documents for years. Trustworthy. Or so she thought. Mr. Thompson revealed that Peterson and Miller had been investigated in the past for unethical practices involving the elderly. Nothing was proven. Everything disappeared. But he kept copies, newspaper clippings, and files. And now, they're trying to repeat it all with you. But they won't succeed. Not if it's up to me. Anger gave way to fear. And fear to action. Margaret stood up, determined. "I want to see everything. I want the videos, the evidence, the names." Mr. Thompson handed over a flash drive. "It's all here. And if something happens to me, my pastor has a copy." Margaret held the object as if it were a sacred weapon. That afternoon, Margaret, Lorraine, and Diane watched the videos together. Diane, embarrassed, tried to explain. "I was angry. I felt betrayed. I thought I was in control. But now I see. I was used too." Lorraine hugged her daughter. "We need to forgive. But we also need to act. This can't continue." Margaret then made a decision. She would go to the police station. And she would take everything. But first, she wanted to confront someone. Attorney Peterson. She scheduled a meeting. Alone. Against everyone's advice. "I need to look him in the eye. I need to tell him I know the truth. And that I'm not afraid." The next day, she entered the office as if entering a battle. Peterson smiled, cordial as always. "Margaret, how nice to see you." She sat calmly, looked him in the eye. "You will listen to me. And you will understand that I am not a helpless old lady. I am a daughter of God. And He is with me." She placed the flash drive on the table. This destroys your career." His smile faded. His hands began to sweat. "I don't know what you're talking about." Margaret didn't shout. She simply quoted Psalm 37, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will bring it to pass." And she left the room without looking back. Peterson never responded. But that same night, Mr. Thompson called with news. "Someone tried to break into my house. They wanted the files." Margaret felt a chill. They're scared. And that's good. But what no one knew was that there was someone else involved. Someone much closer than they imagined. The garden had always been Margaret's refuge. It was there, among the hydrangeas and roses, that she would commune with God. But that late afternoon, something made her stop. A strange creaking sound came from under the wooden bench near the gazebo. She looked down and saw a loose board covered in dry leaves. Curious, she knelt down and carefully pulled the wood away. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic and twine, was a rectangular object. Opening it, her eyes widened, a black-covered notebook with pages yellowed with age. On the first page, familiar handwriting read, "Property of Reverend Thomas C. Blake." Margaret's heart sank. Pastor Thomas had been the leader of the local church for over 20 years. A respected man, with a soft voice, a constant presence during visits to the elderly. But what had he buried in her garden? Why? And why had no one ever mentioned that diary? She flipped through the pages, trying to understand. At first, they were ordinary pastoral notes, biblical reflections, sermon records. But soon the tone changed. There were names, dates, conversations written word for word. And one name kept coming up, Diane. Margaret gripped the notebook tighter. The notes described secret meetings. Diane's confessions about her hurt, her anger, her intentions. But what shocked Margaret was the pastor's attitude. He didn't reprimand. On the contrary, he encouraged seeking justice wisely and using pain as a tool for family rebalancing. Vague, dangerous words. On a bookmarked page, Diane said she was considering taking possession of the house. And his response was, "God gave you intelligence to manage what is rightfully yours. Don't be afraid to use it." Margaret shuddered. This wasn't comfort. It was manipulation. Spiritual, silent, and cruel. There was also a passage where the pastor wrote about prohibitions as a form of protection. And further on, he mentioned meetings with Peterson and Dr. Miller. They were all connected. Margaret felt her world spin. It was all there, hidden, in words written by someone claiming to speak for God. She ran into the house, called Lorraine and Diane. They sat together and read the diary in silence. Diane trembled. "I thought he was helping me. He listened to me, held me. He told me God had a plan, but I never imagined he was leading me to this." Lorraine was in shock. "He was always close to your grandmother. She trusted him completely." Margaret closed her eyes and prayed, "Lord, even if pastors fail, your love is faithful. Don't let my faith die because of human error." It wasn't easy. It was like losing a spiritual anchor. At the end of the diary was a final entry, dated 2 months earlier. "The plan is nearly complete. Margaret's resistance is breaking. One last visit may seal everything. May the Lord have His way." It felt like a profanation. God's name used to justify injustice. Diane felt used. "I thought I was in control. But I was just a pawn in His game." Margaret touched her daughter's shoulder. "But now you know. And knowing sets you free." She remembered John 8:32. "The truth will set you free." And in that house, the truth was finally beginning to come out. Margaret decided not to confront the pastor immediately. First, I needed to understand more. He went to the church and requested access to the records. With the help of a friend from the office, she discovered that several elderly women in the community had been subject to interdiction proceedings in the last 5 years. All had direct links to the pastor. The penny dropped. It was a pattern, a scheme. Quiet, legally sound, but morally rotten. And now, with the diary in hand, there was proof. Proof no one would ever expect to find. Under a park bench. The place where she prayed most. Returning home, Margaret looked up to the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. You use even the ground I walk on to reveal what is hidden." Lorraine agreed. Nothing is hidden from the Father. Diane wept. But this time, they were tears of deliverance. And as if the sky answered, a gentle breeze blew through the garden. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew this was just the beginning. More questions would come. More confrontations, too. But now, she was no longer blind. Nor alone. That night, she received an anonymous call. The voice was female, low, almost a whisper. "I'm one of the victims. I was also interdicted with his help. Please help me." Margaret wrote down the number. The name. Martha. A woman from the church who had disappeared months before. What Margaret didn't yet know was that Martha had even more explosive evidence. Evidence that linked the pastor to something much bigger. And what she would say at their next meeting would leave everyone speechless. Because the final secret was yet to come. Margaret arrived at the address with cold hands and a racing heart. It was a simple house with an unkempt garden and windows covered by old curtains. He knocked twice. When the lock turned, he saw a tired-looking woman with disheveled white hair and an expression of someone carrying too many secrets. "Martha?" he asked gently. The woman nodded, opened the door, and pointed to the armchair in the living room. They sat in silence. Only the ticking of an antique clock filled the air. Martha seemed hesitant, as if still struggling with herself to say what she needed to. "I was complicit," she said finally, her voice low. "Not in all of it, but in part. They promised me things. They wiped out medical debt. They said I was helping protect the elderly. But then, I saw it was all about money, power, control." Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I started taking notes, recording. Secretly. Inside the church, at prayer meetings, even during pastoral visits. I saw Peterson sign papers on behalf of people who didn't even know they were being interdicted. I saw the pastor manipulating families. And I saw Dr. Miller lie about diagnoses." Martha's voice trembled. She grabbed a shoebox from under the bookshelf. "It's all here. Audio files, copies of documents, hidden recordings. I was afraid to hand them over. But when I heard about you, and Diane, I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore." Margaret held the box like it was gold. And in a way, it was. In one of the recordings, the pastor said, "Old people don't react. They're grateful for every scrap. The secret is to appear spiritual while taking everything away." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. Martha wept. "I was deaf. I was blind. But God gave me time to wake up. And now, I want to fix it." Margaret held her hand. "What you did is already starting to make a lot of things right." Martha looked her in the eyes. "You have faith. Don't let it die. I lost mine for a while. But I'm trying to get back." Margaret quoted softly, "The righteous shall fall 7 times and rise again." Martha smiled through tears. That afternoon, Margaret returned home with the box in her arms. Lorraine was waiting for her at the door. Diane, inside, was preparing dinner. When they opened the contents together, they fell silent. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. It was the key to exposing everything and saving others who were still trapped. Diane watched one of the audios and began to cry. "I heard those words every week. He used the Bible to make me feel guilty." Margaret hugged her daughter. "The Word of God sets free. Whoever imprisons in His name will answer before Him." Lorraine added, "God's justice may be delayed, but it never fails." In the following days, Margaret and Martha prepared a dossier. They went to the prosecutor's office together. They handed over everything, name by name, date by date. It was more than a complaint. It was a testimony of liberation. In the hallway, before leaving, Martha said, "I will never hide what I know again. God has given me this second chance." The news spread. Other victims began to emerge. Children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews. Families who never understood why their mothers had suddenly ended up in nursing homes. elderly women who had lost their rights without realizing it. The scandal began to take shape. But Margaret knew the hardest part was yet to come. She received a letter from the pastor. Handwritten. No confession. But with a veiled threat, "Be careful what stones you throw. They may come back." Margaret read it aloud and then burned it. Those who live by lies cannot bear the truth. And then she called the local news station. She decided to give an interview. Standing face to face, with a clean face, a firm voice, and a Bible in hand, she told her story. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. And as an instrument of justice. The video went viral. Women across the country began sharing it. "This happened to my aunt. To my mother. To me." Diane now observed everything with more humble eyes. She cared for her mother with more love. He visited Lorraine more often. And he attended church, but not the same anymore. He found a new pastor. A man of simple, unpretentious faith. Who taught her that forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's liberation. Martha was called to testify. And her testimony was decisive. "Through tears," she said, "I sinned. But today I'm here to prevent others from being deceived." The prosecutor held up the recording. "With this, we will open a formal investigation against all those named." Margaret prayed every night. Not for revenge, but for justice. And for peace. She knew the road would be long. But she was no longer alone. And very soon, a public hearing would take place. And someone special would appear to testify. Someone everyone thought would never set foot in the city again. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, family members, elderly people, local officials. The buzz was constant. Margaret entered hand in hand with Diane and Lorraine. Her eyes were puffy, but her posture was firm. They knew that this day would change everything, for many people. In the front row, Martha sat with a Bible open on her lap. Mr. Thompson, standing in the back, discreetly filmed. And behind them all, sitting together, were some elderly people who had been victims of the same system. It was as if the pain of an entire city was gathered there, waiting for justice. The judge entered. Silence fell like a veil. One by one, the defendants were called. Peterson, the attorney, maintained his composure. Dr. Miller tried to appear calm. Pastor Thomas entered with a Bible in his hands, but his eyes downcast. Diane fixed the three with a look that said, "Now it's our turn." Margaret was the first to testify. She told her story calmly, without exaggeration, but with the firmness of someone who no longer fears. She showed documents, described the days of isolation, the attempted interdiction, the silent network of manipulation. When she finished, the courtroom gave a standing ovation. Even the judge was moved. Then came Martha. And with her, the audio recordings, the copies of forged medical reports, the distorted spiritual guidance. Peterson's name appeared on almost every document. Dr. Miller was visibly nervous. The pastor was sweating, fidgeting with his fingers as if praying without faith. And then, the officer announced a new witness. The defense allows David Owens to testify. The entire room turned its necks. Diane froze. Margaret took her hand. The man walked in with firm steps, an envelope under his arm. His gray hair, his beard neatly trimmed, his gaze determined. Diane whispered, "I thought he was gone forever." Margaret replied, "Maybe God saved him for this moment." David got straight to the point. He said he had been unfairly removed. He showed copies of recordings made at the time of the divorce, in which Diane was encouraged by others to manipulate him. But the most shocking part was the video he handed over. An old recording, made without Diane's knowledge, in which the pastor said, "Your husband is not your enemy. But if he gets in the way of the plan, you need to take him out of the picture." The judge ordered it to be repeated. The silence was so profound, tears could be heard. Diane wept, ashamed but also relieved. It was as if someone had finally confirmed that she, too, had been a victim of a distorted faith, of a malign influence, of a power game that extended beyond the home. Margaret held her hand tenderly. Lorraine wiped away a discreet tear. David didn't stop there. He revealed that the pastor had received donations from families under interdiction. He showed checks, receipts, and emails. It was the final proof that everything was premeditated. When he finished, the judge called a recess. Everyone left the courtroom in shock. But on Margaret's face, there was peace. In the hallway, Diane approached David. For the first time in years, they looked at each other as people who had shared love, pain, and silence. "Thank you for coming back," she said. He replied, "Not for you, but for her." He pointed to Margaret. "She deserves justice. You all do." Back in the courtroom, the judge declared the formal opening of criminal proceedings against Peterson, Dr. Miller, and the pastor. The three were escorted out. Some elderly people applauded. Others wept. But everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The cycle was beginning to break. God's justice was finally in motion. As she was leaving, a reporter approached Margaret. "Do you have anything to say to other women going through something similar?" She thought for a few seconds. Then she replied, "Yes. May they never let anyone take what God gave them, the freedom to live with dignity. And that, even in silence, God listens. He sees. He acts." The interview went viral. The story spread across the news. Churches began reviewing their boards. Clinics underwent audits. It was as if a new light had been lit throughout the region. Margaret wasn't seeking fame. But God had placed her there, as the voice of one who had never been heard. And while many celebrated the victory, she returned home with her heart full of questions. Because, deep down, she knew there were still missing pieces. Lorraine was pensive. Diane was quieter than usual. And at the bottom of one of the folders handed out at the hearing, there was a photo. A photo of Lorraine, with an unknown woman. On the back, a date. And an enigmatic phrase, "What was buried was not yet forgotten." Margaret froze. It was another story waiting to be told. And perhaps, the most painful of all. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The photo in her hands seemed to burn. Lorraine appeared younger, with short hair and a shy smile, and beside her, a woman with intense eyes and a scarf tied around her head. On the back, handwritten, "Grace, Summer 1987. Margaret had never heard that name. At breakfast, Margaret placed the photo on the table. Lorraine stopped chewing. Her face paled. Her eyes filled with tears before any words could be spoken. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Margaret replied softly, "In the file folder. Someone wanted you to see it." Lorraine held the photo in both hands, as if holding her own soul. "She was my sister, Grace. Older, stronger, braver, and more vulnerable than anyone knew." Diane watched in silence. The atmosphere was heavy, sacred, as if something very old was resurfacing. Lorraine took a deep breath and began to tell her story. Grace had a huge piece of land, inherited from our grandfather. She had no children. She was very attached to the church. When she became ill, the pastor approached her. He told her God had plans. He said she could help the divine mission with that land. Margaret already knew where this was going. Lorraine confirmed. They signed documents. They made donations. They promised the land would be used to build a Christian shelter. But they never built anything. The land was sold. Grace died thinking she had done something good. The tears were streaming uncontrollably now. Only after she left did I find out everything. The lawyer, the same one. Peterson, the pastor, the same one. Thomas. They'd been doing this for a long time. I kept quiet, because no one would believe me. I was just the younger sister. No proof. No voice. Diane squeezed her mother's hand. "It's not your fault, Mom." Lorraine lowered her head. "But I've held on to this pain all these years. And when I took you to Margaret, I thought, at least you'll be protected from all this. But now I see, the evil has turned around. And it's back to us." Margaret stood, walked around the table, and hugged Lorraine from behind. "You didn't fail. You survived. And now, you can close this wound." Lorraine wept silently. Diane, overcome with emotion, stood up too. 3 women. 3 generations. 3 stories intertwined by a truth so ancient. It was then that Margaret had an idea. Does the land still exist? Lorraine nodded. It was sold, but never used. It's abandoned. Margaret looked her in the eye. What if we took this place back? What if, with justice, we made what Grace dreamed of, a real place of welcome? A support center for older women. Diane perked up. We could name her Grace Community Center. Lorraine smiled through her tears. It would be like restoring her memory and turning pain into hope. It was a bold idea, but not impossible. Margaret knew that now, with the case's visibility, doors would open. Over the next few days, Margaret and Diane investigated the land records. With the help of Martha and the local developer, they discovered that the sale had been made with dubious clauses. Most importantly, Grace's original donation had been made under duress, which invalidated part of the contract. The prosecutor was touched by the story. If we can gather evidence of coercion, we can reverse this sale. And then Margaret had a thought. What if the pastor's diary mentions Grace? They turned to the old pages. And there it was. An excerpt from 1987. Sister Grace relented, thanks to well-directed faith. The land is in good hands. It was enough. Within a few weeks, the case was open. Lorraine had to testify. It was difficult, going back to that time, reliving that pain. But when it was over, she left the room with a lighter heart. I felt like my sister was there. And she forgave me. Meanwhile, the town was beginning to change. Other families were coming to the fore. Young people were helping their mothers and grandmothers understand their rights. Churches were being reshaped. Councils were being created. Margaret knew she couldn't change the whole world, but she could shine a light where there had been darkness. And on a sunny afternoon, as the land hearing concluded, the judge looked at Lorraine and said, Grace's name will live on, and this land will once again serve a worthy purpose. Margaret wept. Diane hugged her. Lorraine, for the first time in a long time, truly smiled. But like every true story, there was more. Back home, Margaret found something among the old newspapers. A yellow envelope, with no return address. Inside, just a handwritten sentence. What about what happened in 1965? Lorraine's face turned white. Margaret shivered. Do you know what this is? She asked. Lorraine hesitated. Yes. But it's the darkest part of it all. And what she was about to tell, no one in that house would ever have expected to hear. The yellow envelope sat on the table as if it had its own weight. Margaret watched it silently, while Lorraine remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor. Diane, confused, asked, What happened in 1965, Mom? Lorraine took a moment to answer. She took a deep breath. And then, she began to speak. I was only 17. It was the hottest summer I can remember. Grace and I were vacationing at Uncle Raymond's farm. A strict man, respected in town, but also cruel in his silence. Margaret frowned. Uncle Raymond? What about him? Lorraine lowered her head. It all started with him. She said that at the time, Grace was engaged to a young black man named Elijah. This caused a scandal in the family. The local pastor, the same Thomas, only younger, said it was a cultural sin. The pressure was so great that a plan was hatched to separate Elijah. And Lorraine was unwittingly complicit. I heard the conversations. I heard Grace being threatened with losing everything. I heard the pastor saying she was bringing shame to the church. And one day, Elijah disappeared. Margaret froze. Disappeared. Lorraine nodded. He was never seen again. They said he left. But Grace never believed it. Neither did I. The silence in that room was suffocating. Lorraine continued. Shortly afterward, Grace fell ill. Depression. Silence. Guilt. And no one spoke of Elijah. Ever again. The pastor said it was a closed chapter. But Grace, she wrote letters. She hid them in prayer books. I read them all after she died. Lorraine pulled an old envelope from her pocket. I've kept this for over 50 years. Inside was a letter from Grace, dated October 1965. In it, she wrote, "If anyone ever knows the truth about Elijah, they will also know that it was silence that killed him. And it was the same silence that slowly killed me, too." Diane was in shock. "You mean, this pastor has been manipulating lives since then?" Margaret closed her eyes. "It goes deeper than we thought." Lorraine held the letter in both hands. "I've carried this guilt my whole life. I never told anyone. I never spoke out. And seeing it all happen again with you, Margaret, it was like watching hell return." Margaret came over and hugged her. "You were a girl. You were used. Like so many of us. But now, Lorraine, now you're breaking the chain." Lorraine sobbed. Diane cried too. There, in that room, was a weight being lifted. A chain being ripped away with the force of truth. They decided to investigate further. With the prosecutor's help, they discovered that Elijah hadn't actually left town. His name was listed in a police report that was never followed up. His body was never found. But a witness from the time, now 90 years old, said he saw men in church clothes arguing with him by the river. It was enough to open a new investigation. Elijah's case was now considered an enforced disappearance. The community mobilized. Young and old began to speak out. The town was awakening from a decades-long slumber. Margaret knew, the truth, even late, can still blossom. Lorraine visited the spot where Elijah was last seen. She brought flowers. He read Grace's letter aloud. He cried. He asked for forgiveness. Not as a guilty person, but as a survivor. And as someone who now chose not to remain silent. Margaret watched from afar. She knew this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. Days later, the city made it official. Grace's former land, now reclaimed, would be used to build the Grace and Elijah Support Center, a place for shelter, reporting, legal support, and prayer for older women. A place of truth, justice, and new beginnings. Diane was appointed assistant director. Margaret, now more wrinkled and stronger, took over the center's chaplaincy. She taught the Bible with love, without manipulation. She used each verse as healing, not as control. Lorraine tended the garden. She planted flowers with names: hope, forgiveness, liberation, truth. The inauguration day was emotional. People from all over the country showed up. Families were rebuilt. Elderly women were liberated. Young people were learning from the past. And there, on a mural, was the phrase that now guided them all: "The truth may hurt, but silence kills." But that night, when everything seemed settled, Margaret found one last envelope. No return address. Just a note with a few words: "You think it's over. But what about the baby born in secret in 1970? She felt her breath catch. She looked at Lorraine, then at Diane. She said nothing. But I knew, deep in my soul, that some stories never end. They just go on. The story you just heard may sound like a movie script, but it's more real than we imagine. How many women like Margaret live today surrounded by silence, manipulated by those they claim to love? How many Lorraines carry old guilt, believing it's too late to fix the past? And how many Dianes, wounded inside, try to regain control of their own lives without realizing they're being used by an invisible system? Maybe you recognized someone in this story. Maybe it reminded you of your grandmother, your mother, or yourself. Maybe you're experiencing a similar situation and haven't yet found the courage to break the cycle. So, I ask you, have you ever felt like someone was taking away your freedom to live your own story? What if a secret buried decades ago was shaping your life without you knowing it? What would you do if you discovered the truth was always around you, waiting to be heard? Would you have the courage to open that door, even if you were afraid of what you'd find on the other side? If this story touched your heart, I invite you to reflect, to talk, to seek help, and to never accept living in silence. God is justice, but He is also comfort. He heals. He restores. And He gave you something no one can take away: the right to live with dignity, faith, and freedom. Comment below. Have you ever experienced something similar? Do you know anyone who could be the real-life Margaret, Diane, or Lorraine? Let's transform this space into a place of support, listening, and prayer. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And together, we can illuminate lives still in the shadows. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now. Turn on notifications to continue following stories that touch the soul and awaken consciousness. And may God bless your life with light, courage, and wisdom. Because sometimes, a story told at the right time can save an entire life.